We're going to start the afternoon session, kicking off with the absolutely amazing James Quilligan. I'm so honored you're with us, and really sorry you couldn't make it in person, our loss, but I'll just do a very brief introduction. Please look at James's bio on the link. But James started his career as a program evaluation supervisor with the United States Labor Department in 1976. So we have a wealth of knowledge coming to the room today. And just very briefly, that has been involved with advisory roles to the United Nations, US House of Representatives, UK House of Commons, and Council on Foreign Relations, and very much kind of being involved also around the like IMF and the distinction between public good and common good, which has been a major influence in my research and my work. But I'm going to let James tell us about all of this himself. Over to you, James. Thank you so much.
I'd like to go start a little bit more about my background by explaining that I got very interested in the relationship between ecology and economics when I was in college. And I got on the track of being able to recognize that, first of all, there was a very tenuous connection between the two things at that point. And I also realized that I was going to specialize in that. And so ultimately, I became a monetary advisor to a lot of governments. And I would not look at, when I looked at their asset sheets, I did not trust that they were actually measuring the ecological value of the commodities that they were placing on their asset sheets. And that led me into a whole study of carrying capacity, which I'm still in. I'm a trainer in carrying capacity at Aarhus University in Aarhus, Denmark. And in any case, that's some of my background. But in thinking about this topic that I'm going to be presenting, which is about distinguishing between private goods, public goods, and common resources or commons, I went back to look at an article that I'd written in 2012 in an anthology that was published by David Bollier and Silke Helfrich. And it was called The Wealth of the Commons. And I went back to look at that, and I looked online, and I was really startled by what I saw. Because, first of all, the article that I wrote was at the top of the list in Google. So I've rarely ever had that happen before. But I was not honored to have that happen, because when I wrote that article about distinguishing between private goods, public goods, common goods, I had imagined that it would start a conversation. And when my article I found at the top of the list, I realized that it had become the standard in the definition of this topic. And I was very displeased, because my thinking around this has really expanded over the last 13 years. And so I said, no, this is no good. I really have to revise the whole analysis of this. It's not that I did anything wrong. I think in those terms, in that time frame, but that things have changed. I've learned a lot since then, and the world has also changed. So essentially, that's the topic I want to talk about. So I would call this negotiating the planetary commons, distinguishing between private goods, public goods, and common goods. So a little background. In the 1930s and 40s, the forces of fascism tried to conquer the industrial world and were defeated by the democratic and communist powers. Today, despotism is again attempting to conquer the world through technology. But now the forces of democracy are in retreat. Post-war neoliberalism and globalization and the free movement of capital that they spearheaded are being rejected. And a new reactionary oligarchy is emerging to seize the ownership and rent of private property across the world. It's not a coincidence that this is taking place as the ecological destruction from climate change is shaking the world's economic foundations, threatening warfare in trade and finance, while threatening the sciences, Earth, and our lives at the same time. There is a widely expressed desire to exploit the environmental crisis for control of the world's existing resources. Left unchecked, this nationalist populism may spread across the world, culminating in disastrous wars for the public goods and common resources still remaining to be securitized and commodified into assets for the marketplace. We, human beings, have lost our vision of who we are and our purpose. From an unbroken ontological perspective, our ancient planet has always been a commons, which civilization has organized very recently in history into sovereign markets. Common resources are the original mother. Private property and public goods are her descendants. This teaches that the commons are not a collection of individual rights or a single collective property managed by an authority. This is where the boundaries between individual and collective ownership are blurred. The commons are neither the sum of individual claims nor owned by an organization, but are something distinct that arises through our interaction and collaboration. To understand our commons as relational spaces that are continuously co-created and negotiated, we must recognize them as they are, living, shared experiences that evolve with the people who use them. Scientists and activists have tried to address the crisis of our disappearing commons by slowing the relentless destruction of wilderness areas and restoring distressed ecosystems with the species that once flourished in those places. Yet despite decades of effort, conservation measures have not stemmed the loss of natural habitats and species. Before very long, we must acknowledge that the planetary commons, which encompasses all of the energy that we produce and consume, is our ultimate means of life support for restoration and regeneration. We must be open to the possibilities of more flexible, participatory, and sustainable governance models for the commons, where the emphasis is on interdependence rather than ownership or control. The democratic forces of the world must, once again, mobilize public goods and the collective solidarity of common resources. This will mean reclaiming the commons by sharing resources and using technology to address the resource availability and population needs of carrying capacity through new data, rules, and decision-making. The good news is that the outlines of planetary commons are already developing through our response to environmental disaster and resource justice. 50 years ago, when the era of globalization began, the world's shared stocks and flows of resources were tentatively defined as common goods, meaning that they were beyond the capacity of nations to own or manage. In the 1960s and early 70s, the Common Heritage of Mankind movement familiarized the world with the common resources that exist beyond public goods. I know that very well because I was on the wavelength of that movement when it was flourishing. In the decades that followed, experts like Elinor Ostrom and David Bollier focused primarily on common pool resources. By this definition, formulated during an era of resistance to neoliberalism within the social sciences, the commons meant collective, non-excludable resources governed through polycentric decision-making. I break that down in the paper I wrote in 2012, which is on the internet. But to make it simple, in this decentralized bottom-up approach, multiple overlapping authorities would manage the resources of local and indigenous communities collectively through traditional knowledge and participatory governance. Successful examples were community-managed fisheries and indigenous stewardship of the Amazon rainforest. But the idea was also loosely applied to the collective governance of natural resources beyond national borders, such as the 1987 Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, and the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. This approach, the global commons approach, appealed to many people who recognized that the world has been a commons from the very beginning. But global commons governance has taken a top-down approach from the 1970s until recently. International institutions like the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and various biodiversity treaties have created binding regulations on the use of planetary resources. Some of them intended to limit the overreach of market capitalism and national sovereignty, have been able to protect areas for agriculture, forests, and fisheries. The global commons approach worked to a limited extent and offered some hope. But the commons has not flourished in other more contentious areas, such as outer space, deep sea mining, and proliferation of toxic fertilizers and plastics. In the 1970s and 80s, the meme of the global commons was think globally, act locally. Some called this a cosmo-local unity through which all commons could be shared as governments and markets gradually disappeared. What has disappeared instead is the direct connection between world leaders and the people back home on the ground. I know this very well because I've been on both sides of it. That gap has completely closed. For example, the growing bioregional communities, which are valiantly trying to finance ecosystem commons today, are not focusing on the geopolitics or monetary systems that will end up determining the planetary commons. Working in isolation, few of us can actually withdraw from the state to live by the cosmic principles of life-affirming commons when they are already tightly enclosed by the strictures of national governments that are suspicious of all forms of public cooperation and collective action. Nor could we avoid the market-based governance which has involved economic programs like carbon pricing, cap and trade, and sustainability certification to create incentives for resource use. Creating financial motivation for sustainability has engaged businesses, but it has also created vast inequalities in market access. There is a growing recognition that the world needs a strong and enduring framework for its planetary commons, which is unlike that of the small-scale Ostrom commons. What is needed now must be polycentric like Ostrom's, encouraging local self-organization and decision-making rather than top-down authority. At the same time, resources themselves differ from resource systems. The overemphasis on decentralized rules for common pool resources has precluded collective rules for the regulation of the Earth systems that generate our resource commons. That is not to diminish the significance of local commons and how important it is to change the world from the place where we live and work. It's only to say that the two poles, local and planetary, have yet to be integrated. And it is our task to bring them to scale and manage the complex problems of a new generation of world institutions for monitoring and optimizing planetary carrying capacity, managing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, regulating and disposing the satellite debris left in space, measuring fossil fuels and other forms of energy, safeguarding groundwater resources and topsoil, protecting oceans against acidification, pollution, and overfishing, collecting and repurposing plastics across the planet, and fighting pandemics and other world health problems, plus a number of other topics that I have not addressed. The vision of a global commons failed because it was top-down. We must not make that mistake again. For most people, the distinction between private goods and public goods is quite clear. But few have much experience or training in distinguishing public goods from common goods. The traditional definition was that public goods are accessible to anyone, and one person's use does not restrict their availability to others. On the other hand, common resources are shared by a community, but may pollute that may deplete these commons through overuse. These definitions still pertain locally, but there is a shift in the meaning of commons at the planetary level. For planetary action to occur, decision-making must be broadened beyond the framing of the local ecosystem. Local communities must begin to see themselves working within a nested system of governance that is coordinated through interlinked, reinforcing networks and cooperation with stakeholders to ensure planetary resilience and sustainability without top-down authority. This is why an integrative plan to recover the planetary commons is sorely needed. Acknowledgement of the planetary commons is necessary to establish governance and law to transform our relationship to the land, the seas, the environment, the atmosphere, and the planet. Unlike a neighborhood meeting, agreements for environments like biomes and the biosphere require a far broader set of management principles while directly representing people's concerns. We need planetary stewards to govern the planetary commons in the public interest, which means these commons must be treated as public goods because they will offer distributive benefits such as clean air, clean soil, clean water, and clean energy. For this to work, the framework for planetary steward institutions must be focused on earth science, international law, and public governance that collectively secure the biophysical functions of resource systems and slow the release of entropy into the waste sinks of the atmosphere, the oceans, and land, which we familiarly recognize as global warming, hurricanes and storms, desertification, ice cap melting, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, invasive species, plastic pollution in oceans, oil spills, nutrient runoff and dead zones, soil erosion, habitat loss through urbanization, waste accumulation in landfills and e-waste, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In his in-depth analysis, Johan Rockström has proposed a global governance regime for each of the 9 planetary boundaries. His planetary commons include the biophysical functions of the biosphere of life, including humans, who interact with the Earth system spheres of the atmosphere of air, the hydrosphere of water, the lithosphere of land, and the cryosphere of ice and snow. A few treaties and conventions for climate, biodiversity, and oceans exist through the UN system, but the rest would have to be created anew. The problem with this is that Rockström provides only half of the means for measuring the planet's metabolism. His planetary boundaries, climate change, biosphere integrity, nitrogen and phosphorus, ocean acidification, land system change, freshwater, green and blue water, ozone, and atmospheric aerosols, consist mainly of resource thresholds, but overlook the physiological or biotic needs of Earth's species. Rockström's world does not include the factors necessary for the development of carrying capacity indicators, the metabolic relationship between available resources, and the needs of human beings and all species. It reminds us that our commons are inherently relational and emergent, not static or fixed entities. They are fluid and shaped by the communities that interact with them. There must be a more comprehensive way to protect the Earth through the governance of its biophysical systems. The framework of global common heritage, which evolved during the post-war period for the high seas, deep seabeds, outer space, Antarctica, and the atmosphere, was shared by many nations through their protection and governance for the collective good. But these treaties were governed very differently and weakened by the global negotiations of sovereign states with modest capacities for environmental protection. While global commons managers set a precedent for collective action, they could not manage the legal, political, and economic limitations of sovereign states, nor the biophysical limits of the Earth system, thereby weakening its resilience and undermining its capacity to sustain life across the planet, including the stability of our societies. This is why stewardship of the Earth system through justice and cooperation for present and future human and non-human populations must be established before sustainability can be achieved. In the concluding section, I propose planetary negotiations for the political regionalization of common resources and a trans-regional campaign for the ecological and economic regeneration of common systems. This will require new forms of education and organization to integrate private property, public goods, and common resources. 3 domains with specific checks and balances, unlike before in the global commons. At the core of this new political economy is a historic agreement among all nations to live within the sustainable yield of renewable resources such as food, water, and energy, and to make a careful plan for the use of non-renewable resources with the purpose of phasing them out before they are depleted. It is important that we distinguish these domains specifically for them to evolve as clear principles in this and future centuries. I said a lot of things that were quite complex, and I'm actually categorizing a few things, but I hope that this diagram that I'd like to take a moment to share with you will clarify it. And then in the second half of my presentation, I think I'll be able to define it in much more clarity. So after extensive conversations with a lot of people, and also in recognition that the idea of the planetary is now a major issue in universities across the world, to distinguish between the planetary and the global. So the global is looked at now as the age of globalization, the age that we've come through since the 1970s. And now to create this new metaphor or new worldview, the world is beginning to embrace the word planetary rather than global. And I think there's a lot of value in this. That's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing is that when we come to the way that private property and public goods and common resources are examined, it seems to me that we're going to have to reshape our thinking a little bit as we move forward if we want to be able to create, which I'm proposing, is planetary commons. We have to begin to see that there's something missing in terms of our planetary institutions. The UN agencies and other former international organizations that were trying to develop protocols for managing the commons at the international level are failing pretty badly. The task is much too large for governments to handle. So, as I'll explain shortly, nation states and corporations, in their deal that has been made under neoliberalism, have dropped the ball. They're not endowing the planetary institutions with the needed funds or the vision or the authority to make wise rules on behalf of the planetary public. So at the same time, what I'm going to be suggesting in a moment is that the social contract that we've been living under for a long time has broken down. People are not respected anymore. Nation states are serving corporations far more than they're serving their own people. Meanwhile, as you know, within cities, within urban environments of all kinds, and especially in rural areas where bioregionalism is beginning to flourish, there is a new spirit which is taking hold, which I think is really welcome and here to stay. And I believe that the bioregional movement will be an anchor for the commons in the future. That's not to say that it won't be involved in urban areas. However, I've done a lot of work in this area, and I can tell you that the urban areas serve as kind of the core, whereas the bioregions serve as kind of the periphery, and that certainly the bioregions are necessary for the core or the urban environments to flourish. And in that sense, the urban environment is part of a bioregion. It is dependent on the bioregion, ultimately. So in that regard, I'm going to go back to what I was describing to you in part 2 and explain what I see as the way we can move forward. So I call this section Negotiating a Cooperative Agreement for Earth System Law. An integrative solution for the interests of private property, public goods, and common resources must be found. So let's first examine how we arrived at this point through the creation of sovereign nation states. Sovereignty is the supreme authority over the citizens of individual nations, guaranteeing their freedom and security from outside interference in exchange for the state's power to rule over them. This system was cobbled together in 1648 after many fierce conflicts in Europe to protect the security of nations. From the 18th to 21st centuries, this arrangement gradually evolved to protect the political economy of nations. This fragile agreement reached its apogee from 1945 to 1975, when it seemed as though democratic capitalism would support the global commons well into the future. Since then, global capital has been steadily eroding the sovereignty of nations, even rivaling their state powers through increasing trade, finance, and technology. With governments increasingly reliant now on the market economy for their financial stability, the sovereignty of nations no longer means honoring a social contract with citizens, but private contracts with businesses. Since 2000, with the sluggish GDP of democratic-leaning nations and the rise of autocratic governments across the world, it became more and more unlikely that private wealth would be redistributed for public projects, let alone invested in ecological rejuvenation. So the situation has now gone well beyond the cross-border agreements of the global commons era. Humanity is now facing the predicament that our social, legal, and political systems do not measure Earth's ecosystems because they operate for a different purpose and on a different scale. Nations are still governing themselves, but they are not genuinely seeking ways to address the transnational problems that bridge the mutual ecological, institutional, and cultural areas of nations based on collective rather than private boundaries. Unequipped to address broad-scale environmental changes, nations must now organize around a common interest in planetary carrying capacity. The sovereign powers of self-determination and national security must now be redefined to enable states to authorize planetary and bioregional governance of the planetary commons. A new system of stewardship to safeguard the planet through collective management and sustainment for the benefit of all of life, both present and future. Parallel with the upward development of planetary steward institutions, sovereign nations must also divest governmental power downward for the benefit of bioregional commons and their communities. How would this be done? An age-old but seldom applied principle is called subsidiarity, which means that authority must be allocated to the smallest scale institution capable of governing an important project. Essentially, subsidiarity means that to relinquish their sovereign heritage to the people, governments and their oligarchs must devolve authority to the regions that already have a vested interest in the management, distribution, and sustainability of local and regional resources. By its indigenous definition, the sovereignty of a commons refers to the legitimacy of people to participate in democratic decision-making, where place-based knowledge from earlier cultures is embedded through their regional habitats, natural resources, and cultural traditions. In this sense, bioregions are clearly the ontological basis for an Earth-centric movement, which is now evolving out of the self-centric global commons as a fair and nonviolent option in our fraught geopolitical world. National and planetary subsidiarity must be granted to the people's bioregions through the self-organization of resource sovereignty. Subsidiarity, giving power back to the people, thus expresses citizens' rights to generate the resources necessary to live within their abilities in the local and regional communities they inhabit. This is also instrumental for another reason. The planetary community will not self-organize easily in the aftermath of a world war. But climate change is very different. There will be no more space for a clash of civilizations or the militancy of geopolitics when we recognize that the entropy of global warming is the common enemy that we all have, all of us, which we have conjured up through the heat waste of fossil fuels, production, consumption, and armed conflict. We will see that economic decisions are ultimately ecological because they involve the energy arising from nature. We will understand that the management of resources by governments and corporations has been inefficient and counterproductive at the regional and local levels, and that planetary cooperation is absolutely necessary. We will recognize the folly of techno-corporate oligarchs taking over the world's key energy extraction, production, consumption, industries, and technologies. which are the biggest entropy sinks in the world, we will recognize that individual freedom is never the same as collective freedom. So that even dictatorial or libertarian states will realize that local and regional ecosystems are where conservation, regeneration, and resilience will have to occur. Otherwise, the world will become scarcely livable. So, to avoid utter disaster through peaceful means, a new agreement for the greater common good must be reached. Since the economic data that planetary and national decision makers use is already vested in our subsidiary ecological communities, sovereign states will be forced to become less expansionist and bestow much greater power and discretion upon their citizens. Data will now be collected according to the world's ecosystems, not national or subnational political boundaries. International corporations, which did not exist until 2 centuries ago, will be transformed by meeting carrying capacity thresholds for planetary self-reliance. This means going beyond market pricing of resources and focusing on scientific analysis to guide the livability for everyone on Earth. Degrowth is simply about how entropy must be slowed, not accelerated, by sharing the natural and cultural resources of Earth. Evolutionary science will teach the self-determination of citizens that stems from their local and regional ecosystems, not survival of the fittest, but the regenerative power of people working together directly within their own environment. That resilience will develop into widespread cooperation and solidarity in communities, workplaces, sectors, the state, and planetary institutions. That is why there will be little resistance against using the principle of subsidiarity to organize the basis of a life-enabling planetary commons, bringing stability between resource availability, utilization, and replenishment in local and regional areas. That is the essence of it. When nations transfer greater power downward to their own regions and communities, citizens will allow governments to transfer significant power upward to planetary institutions. This agreement will create a new type of biophysical governance, law, and economics with entirely different indicators and incentives for sustainability at all levels. The next question is, who will have authority for the planetary commons? If it is not governments, who will serve the primary role of stewards of the planetary commons? Local commoners may have the capacity to work at regional and transnational levels, but most of us are not prepared to work at the planetary level. Is it possible to create a planetary institution beyond the United Nations General Assembly that would be responsible for the oversight, monitoring, and governance of the different departments of our planetary commons? There is great fear of a world government. But a new version of the United Nations Trusteeship Council could guarantee representative and equal decision-making on issues involving the carrying capacity between Earth's resources and the biophysical needs of its populations. The vast experience of regional experts would certainly be useful in these planetary steward institutions, particularly when the creation of public goods at the planetary level is bolstered by the divestment of sovereign power to bioregional communities from nation states. And the technology clearly exists to establish a planetary referendum for the election of planetary stewards. The other leading candidates for these planetary roles are corporations that serve the private interest. Many corporations would entertain planetary projects if significant profits or subsidies were involved. Yet, if this trend gets the upper hand and self-interest dominates the planetary vision, there is little possibility of redistributing national economic growth or private wealth, let alone reinvesting at the grassroots, whether for infrastructure or ecological rejuvenation. Is it likely that corporations could be transferred? Is it likely that corporations could be transformed to produce public goods? It remains to be seen if planetary institutions could avoid becoming an illiberal technocracy, particularly in the use of sophisticated tools like geographic information systems, remote sensing, teletechnology, machine learning, and drones and AI for surveillance. Citizens of the world would never permit authoritarian control of its planetary commons, even after a world war, when these same tools could be used cooperatively and responsibly to ensure planetary life support systems for the collective good of humanity. But the planetary community will not be assembling in the aftermath of a world war. Soon, there will be no more space for a clash of civilizations, of militarized geopolitics, when we recognize that the entropy of global warming is the common enemy that we have all conjured up through this heat and stench of production, consumption, and armed conflict. Our resilience to the mass devastation of the climate emergency will develop widespread cooperation and solidarity in communities, workplaces, sectors, the state, and planetary institutions. These people must organize the life-enabling planetary commons. States will not go away, but the practice of sovereignty must be transformed upwards and downwards so that all people are given the responsibility to be stakeholders in the peaceful governance of the planetary commons. That's why a decentralized planetary system based on economic democracy would be welcomed by almost everyone when they realize its life-giving benefits. This is vastly different than the social contract proposed by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, who wanted to ensure an absolute sovereign government to protect citizens through a civil society and avoid discord, civil war, and a war of all against all. That agreement is what has led to the present disaster. It allowed both neoliberalism and authoritarianism, working in breach of a democratic social contract, to blur the benefits created by the public goods of governments during the past few centuries, to justify the confiscation of greater wealth for themselves. The public trust is broken. It is no longer making any sense to say that governments issue public goods when they primarily protect and expand private goods. Now that the United States has retreated into mercantilist isolation, the charade of liberal democracy through technocratic capitalism, 1975 to 2015, is in ashes, and the future is unclear. A new order has begun to emerge, with the prospect of major civilizations decoupling now from the environment in order to compete for the world's resources. With the planet's ecosystems in perilous decline, this is a grave emergency. That's why the social contract for a planetary commons will redefine Earth's system governance. Planetary stewardship will only work through the sharing of resources and an equitable system of governance. For this reason, planetary steward institutions will be dealing with public goods, not commons or common resources, because these institutions will be entrusted for that purpose by the planetary public. The term planetary commons indicates how common resources are nested throughout the scope and scale of decision-making for all biophysical Earth-regulating systems and their functions. This accounts for the three significant components in the development of the planetary commons: the downward empowerment of bioregional commons by national governments, the surrender of technological power by the nation state upwards to the planetary stewards, and the transformed role of states and corporations, who must, after all, develop a level of technological complexity, collaboration, and trust that they have seldom demonstrated in recent years. Geopolitical realism would argue that none of this is possible, but life, humanity, and the future of the planet beckon otherwise. Thank you for your kind attention.